Thank you everyone for joining us for our conversation from the Colonial Society. I am Bob Allison, the president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and we're really delighted to see so many people joining us virtually by way of Zoom. And so what we have tonight is a conversation among three people who probably know this field and know what they're talking about better than any other three people we could find. And we have Gerald W.R. Ward, Jerry Ward, who is the Katherine Lane Weems Senior Curator of American Decorative Arts and Sculpture Emeritus at the Museum of Fine Arts. And he's also a consulting curator at the Portsmouth Historical Society. He and his wife, Barbara, live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And in fact, he represents Portsmouth in the New Hampshire State House of Representatives, the Rockingham District 28. And he is been in Portsmouth since 1988. He graduated from Harvard College, got a PhD from Boston University, and then in 1992 went to the Museum of Fine Arts, where he succeeded Ned Cooke as associate curator, and he worked with Jonathan Fairbanks at the MFA until Jonathan's retirement and his retirement. And Barbara McLean Ward is also with us, and she also received her PhD from BU in American and New England Studies. This is an all BU program tonight. We didn't realize that when we were organizing it. And Barbara got her bachelor's degree at Connecticut College. She wrote her dissertation on early Boston silversmiths, and since then she's written many articles on Boston silver, New England church silver, and she contributed about 80 biographies to Massachusetts silversmiths and jewelers. She worked at the Yale University Art Gallery, where she and Ned first met, and she's also worked at the Winterthur Museum, the Essex Institute, the Strawberry Bank Museum, and she is currently the Moffatt-Ladd House's first director curator. And she's taught at BU, Yale, the University of Delaware, the University of New Hampshire, Tufts, and the Museum, the Mass College of Art. And has also been the assistant editor of the Journal of American Folklore. And she's also a member of the Colonial Society's Museum Committee. So we're really delighted to have Barbara with us as well. And I guess our guest of honor is Edward S. Cooke, Ned Cooke, who is the Charles Montgomery Professor of American Decorative Arts in the Department of the History of Art at Yale University, where he has taught since 1992. And he is the author of several books, including Making Furniture in Pre-Industrial America. And he's currently working on a book on global objects toward an interconnected art history. And he's been working to expand the field of decorative arts, which has led to several awards. And he also, in addition to several awards and honors for his work, he has served as chair of the department at Yale. Undergraduate degree from Yale, MA from the Winterthur Institute, and a PhD from BU, and he's curated exhibits at the MFA, the Peabody Essex Museum, the Davis Museum at Wellesley. And we're really here tonight to talk about his terrific book, Inventing Boston, which looks at we'll hear what the book looks at. It really is looking at the history of Boston between 1680 and 1720, looking at 6 different materials from which Bostonians built their world. And so with that, I am delighted to turn the program over to Ned Cooke, Jerry Ward, and Barbara Ward. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much, Bob. It's a pleasure joining you all and giving you the opportunity to really share this book, which actually goes way back to conversations with Barbara and Jerry when we were all at Yale together. So there are these intersecting paths that do continue. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of start with how I got interested initially in this topic. And it was when I was at the curator at the MFA, and we were able to acquire this chest on chest, which to me, became a very instructive object, because people in Britain looked at it and said, that couldn't be British. People in Boston looked at it and said, it couldn't be Boston. And it was one of these things that fell into the middle of the Atlantic in some respects. And it really got me thinking about what was going on in Boston at a period when people weren't paying much attention, somewhere between the Great Migration, in the original first and second generation of settlement of New England, and then the ramp up to the Revolution, a period that, other than Bernard Bailyn, hasn't really received a lot of attention. And it also was driven by galleries, going through a lot of exhibition galleries in which you oftentimes had very elaborate Baroque silver next to post-medieval joined furniture, and trying to sort of reconcile these two different kinds of worlds. And further sort of became interested in trying to take a look, not just sort of at it as Boston centric per se, but actually trying to thinking about Boston within the Atlantic world. And there was this 1695 map by Robert Marden, one of the great map makers in England at this time, who portrayed this new English empire, and in it sort of having the whole coast, Atlantic coast down to the Caribbean, even sort of in the lower right, that whole detail of the Atlantic world. But interestingly, what is the main focus right above the cartouche was, and next to the cartouche is a map of the harbor of Boston, which really sort of places Boston at the center of the English gaze over to the Atlantic world, into the coastal Atlantic world. And to me, it says so much about Boston's place, certainly as Mark Peterson has gone on to talk about as well. And just to sort of thinking about the time period, I've mentioned it's a period that most people don't pay a lot of attention to. It's a period of great turmoil to really start to think about the revocation of the charter, of more imperial concern about what's going on in the colony rather than leaving it alone, of commercial kinds of growth, of Long Wharf being extended, the ways in which wars, both with France as well as what's going on in the Caribbean in the early 18th century, all of these start to have an impact on what's going on in Boston at this point. So what I decided to do was to take a deep dive into what's going on in Boston and to try to think about local production, imported production, to think about the world of goods. In essence, to thinking about Boston's place in the larger Atlantic world, but not through the archives, the Royal Archives, not through the Public Record Office, or from sort of a view from Whitehall, nor a view from the State House that would be political. And so to me, it's sort of not thinking about royal records, the letters and accounts of prominent merchants, but how do we actually start to think about what's going on the ground between people, oftentimes people who left no written record. And I decided to divide it up by 6 different media that sort of had an impact on everyday life in Boston at this particular point in time, and materials that were going to be imported, materials are going to be locally produced, things that were going to be adjusted, adapted, that might come from elsewhere, and trying to think about how these different languages might come together. So thinking about architecture, I was thinking about brick and what brick really represented in terms of sort of the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire of 1668, and sort of thinking about how Boston modeled itself, because of fires, et cetera, what their view was of trying to present a up-to-date commercial port. And certainly a lot of people studying architecture have looked at the grand kinds of houses, and thought about the mansions like Foster Hutchinson, the Clark House, Clark Franklin House that you see here. But as I started looking through different kinds of records, through later maps that would indicate the materials out of which houses were made, I became very interested in a different kind of building tradition, and that was the leasehold tradition, which in some respects you might think of as artisans collaborating and providing sweat equity to build houses for each other, to develop new blocks, to develop blocks that were just expanding at this time. And certainly the Clough House right near Old North Church is one of these surviving examples of a collaboration between joiners, house wrights, and bricklayers who were able to partner up and build and therefore get a foothold in this town. And it seems to me that people like Bernie Herrmann have talked about this leasehold system later on in the early 19th century, but there are ways in which even in the early 18th century, there were ways in which a local material, clay coming from Medford, is packaged and rebuilding parts of Boston in a loose Palladian style that is copying some of what is going on in London, sort of mid-range developments at the same time. If I might think of another material, local material, slate, which is being quarried in Charlestown, and how gravestones are this very distinctive, slate gravestones are a very distinctive American product. Instead of just thinking about what are the most ornate kinds of stones, or thinking about people like Alan Ludwig and others who have sort of talked about early sculpture in colonial America, I was more interested in these objects as commodities, as products of different shops that could be plain, as you see the Marcy Allen stone on the left, or they could be quite elaborate, like the Pierpont stone on the right. And starting to think about the shop traditions that are making these stones, and realizing that in many ways, slate is not used for gravestones in England at this point, that the Anglican Church would favor what are known as the sort of tabletop kinds of stones, so that this whole idea of a vertical format of the use of slate, of then also not burying by religion and burial ground and church burial grounds, but actually community-based burial grounds. So places like Copp's Hill have 2 or 3 different churches represented, Baptist as well as congregational, in those burying grounds, people next to one another, even though they belong to different churches, because it was really their neighborhood that they were being thought of in terms of their identity. And the other thing that I found so interesting about the Boston gravestones is that they, rather than being sort of driven by sculptural or architectural kinds of conceptions, which is really what is typical of a lot of British stones at the same time, these are really sort of print-based. They are really much more like the frontispiece of a book in terms of borders, in terms of different kinds of ornamental designs around print. And it's really about the print, which always starts with "here lies" or "here's the body of." And so to me, it's oftentimes really about place. And the fact that people are marking that they belong to a specific place, initially in Boston. And then as the industry develops, they start shipping stones to the North Shore, South Shore, Connecticut and Long Island, all the way down to Charleston, South Carolina. So it becomes a business in many ways. The third material that I wanted to look at was wood and its relationship to furniture, and certainly the plentiful wood, not in Boston itself, but in the surrounding countryside, enabled this kind of flexibility of production, of taking forms like a cane chair, imported, which was a great import in the 1670s, 1680s, and then starting to adapt it to local kinds of variations of leather-covered chairs, of split spindle-back chairs with flag seats, sort of running a whole variety of price points for these particular tall-backed, sort of jutted, two-angled back, offset back, that were geared towards some degree of comfort, and even thinking about upholstery as opposed to cane and what that meant in terms of seatability in these particular chairs. But it's not just sort of the availability of maple, of oak to be used in transforming this kind of imported fashion, but also speaking to the ways in which the Boston cabinet makers are oftentimes clued right into what's going on in areas like natural history. This interested in the microscopic, that say Robert Hooke, who's one of the great natural philosophers, looking at sections of all sorts of different materials of seaweed, of cork and various other things, and to realize that this idea of representation of what cannot be seen easily gets translated into this fascination with borough furniture, and the ways in which the cabinet makers in the Boston area were able to take those same sorts of ideas. Wood's plentiful, so it's not like you're using veneer to save money per se, but you're cutting it and you're framing it almost like a line illustration in a natural philosophy book to showcase your awareness of the small natural world, but in this case, writ large on a piece of furniture. And this kind of burl veneer becomes a very popular mode of decoration in the 90s on into the 1720s. The other surface treatment and furniture that is very distinctive to Boston is lacquer work, the imitation of East Asian, particularly Japanese lacquer, which was quite the rage throughout Europe for its durability. It's basically a protoplastic, as well as thinking about the ways in which it's shiny surface. And it's a material that didn't travel well, but instead had to figure out how ways that you could get this to be made out of local materials. Let's see. So what they ended up doing was using varnishes, pigments, etc., as a way of becoming pseudo lacquer. It's a kind of material that was referred to as Japanning. And you see here sort of a British example of Japanning, an example from Boston, where there are people like William Randall coming here in 1713. And it's really one of the, this is the major center of American Japanning, this idea of sort of ersatz lacquer, in which Japan refers to this great kind of pan-Asian kind of material. We might think about textiles, because there's not a lot of textile production locally in New England. Instead, it really is it's a material that lends itself to importation and ways in which they might be able to take advantage of different kinds of materials coming from Norwich, for instance, for turkey work upholstery, of Spitalfield silks, which then might actually have value added to them here that might be raw cloth yardage that could be cut up and tailored. So it's a kind of material that has value added to it. Then you could also have this idea of kits, and certainly Samuel Sewell talks about it. Mary Fiffield's collection of embroidered bed hangings, in which her father, Boston merchant, imports the fustian cloth for the ground, as well as all the embroidery yarns, to stitch it following certain kinds of pre-drawn patterns, which show a great awareness of the Indian painted cottons from the Coromandel coast, which are also appearing in a number of the inventories. Some of the sources of some of the Indian painted cottons are not necessarily even coming through England, but actually are coming through the Caribbean, because that's where the East India Company could unload their cottons without having to pay tariffs, et cetera, going through Britain. So it was able to really control their profits. And the whole notion of that kind of trade via the Caribbean and not through Britain is something that also pans out in terms of ceramics, and what I talked about, the permeability of the empire. And if you looked at a lot of Atlantic history from a kind of imperial point of view, you'd be thinking about the Navigation Acts and the fact that Britain would be controlling all the ceramic kind of consumption in the Americas. But it's not really until the 1720s, 30s, you start to see a lot of British ceramics here in the American colonies. And it's due primarily to production increases in Britain at that point. The story for much of this period is, yes, some British ceramics like sgraffito from the West Country, some of the early Staffordshire, more thinly potted work, even some tin glazed work from London and Bristol. But the real story is how many other kinds of ceramics, whether they be Spanish coming from the Caribbean, like the botella, a great olive oil storage container, French ceramics that are coming from Nova Scotia and New France through sort of illicit trade that people were carrying on to this point, German salt glazed stoneware, some of which was coming through New Netherlands, some of which might be coming through London, even colonial ware, that is that African indigenous kind of production was found as well in Boston. But the most striking thing that I found is this heavy preponderance of Portuguese tin glazed earthenware. And again, it shows the influence of trade with the wine islands. So much of the fish that the Boston merchants were shipping went to the wine islands, and not only for wine to go to Britain, but also for ceramics. Some of these ship captains bringing ceramics back to Boston. The sixth medium that I wanted to look at was silver, and particularly, again, drawn by what the usual records indicate, which is there was such a lack of species in the New World. And I think the problem arises from this notion about silver being only species, in that there was incredible amounts of silver that was being gathered up through privateering, through underwater archaeology, recoveries of people like William Phipps, recovering ingots, as well as pieces of 8, the realis coins. But this was considered not necessarily species, but was considered a raw material. These were things that were then melted down and refabricated in Boston by local silversmiths who could, as Mark Peterson sort of thought, Boston thinking of itself as a city state, deciding to mint their own coins, which is highly illegal in some respects, of using some of these. I mean, a lot of the pine tree shillings, the work of Dummer, et cetera, they were not melting down existing silver that was British silver coming into Boston, but using what's coming from the Caribbean, from the greatest silver mines of Potosi and in Mexico, and getting that silver as a raw material. And furthermore, not simply doing coinage for a little while, then doing some church silver, but then doing some amazing kinds of very aspirational kinds of silver, in which silversmiths who might have been trained in London, and certainly this is where the work that Barbara's has done over the years, points out these kinds of strong connections of workmen coming over here and satisfying this desire, this great thirst for new forms, elaborate forms within the Boston environment. And just to show again sort of that relationship to the Wine Islands, you start in the Iberian Peninsula. There are things like Jeremiah Dummer's two-handled bowl, large lobed sorts of piece that is related directly to Portuguese work, as well as a piece that you see in the lower right recovered from the wreck of the Nuestra Senora de la Concepcion, which was the vessel, the sunk vessel that William Phipps was able to recover the material from, bail out the English government, and ultimately become the first royal governor of Boston. So the ultimate story that you get from looking at these materials, these different media, in which the raw materials coming from a variety of different places, that is being transformed oftentimes by Bostonians, thinking particularly about silver. They're taking Spanish silver. They have Boston silversmiths working in a British, or in this case, an Iberian style, producing something that then starts to build up a distinctive sense of Bostonness. And so to me, it's really sort of this way in which Boston develops and makes their own distinct identity as the center for the Americas, a city-state, in essence, perched on the edge of empire. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but I just thought to show some of the images and sort of why I divided it up might provide some interest.
Thank you very much. So Jerry and Barbara.
We should let ladies go first, I guess.
Yes.
You still do that?
For sure. You want me to go first?
Sure.
I'm obviously really intrigued by this because we, early on when I was an intern at Yale and Ned was the one who could, without getting on a stool, reach the top of the silver cases to open the silver cases for us. We spent a lot of time looking at silver together. And at that point, I was working on my dissertation too. And so we talked a lot about this early period of, particularly in Boston silver. And at the same time, the work was starting to be done for the Boston Silversmiths and Jewelers book, the great tome that Pat Kane finally brought to fruition after years and years and years of effort by a whole lot of different people, and an amazing feat on her part. But I'm struck by, as you know, you're talking tonight about, you know, and going through the book according to the materials that were used, but you make some bigger points in the book that I wonder if you could talk a little bit about. And at one point you actually had talked about how Bostonians began to engage with the British Empire on their own terms, and that they participated in processes that can be, you can talk about interpretation, innovation, and selection. And I'm intrigued, you know, I'd like to have you speak to that a little bit too. And I think both Jerry and I had the question as we read through, is that in contrast to many books in our field, you really have avoided using any stylistic periodization. And I think that's something that's really key to your discussion here, and wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I might actually start with the last point first, and just sort of think sometimes the use of style will tip off in terms of you're thinking about an idealized version of a style, which immediately sends you into for lack of a better term, British-centric point of view. And it's hard not to see what's going on in the colonies as anything other than aberrant copies or whatever. So I was very careful by talking about different media, and I alluded to this a little bit, that slate gravestones are something you don't find in Britain. Nowhere. I mean, slate is only used in, I think, Cornwall and one other place in the late 18th century, which is, to me, fascinating. And the fact that they looked for local material and they actually then have a whole different tradition of marking graves that is not by faith, but is by neighborhood. And that you've got people who are, as I said, Baptist Congregationalists. There's a Baptist carver who's carving for people of lots of different congregations. And so what it does is it sort of shifts this whole focus that they invented, they came up with their own idea of marking graves in some respects that wasn't a tabletop stone. It wasn't something in the church on the floor, but it's this vertical marker. And to me, it's about, it's not even so much about religion so much as it is staking a claim on your sense of history being part of this place. So it's a very conscious kind of history. So the other way to thinking about fabricating their own world, and you could do it by consumption in ceramics, where it's obvious that they're not just beholden on what their contact in London, Bristol, whatever is going to send them, but they're actually ship captains who are, the coastal trade is so important. And the coastal trade is not this kind of, you pick up one thing in Boston and you take it to point B and you sell it and you bring that back to point A. But, these Boston ship captains are hustlers. They're packing up whatever they can get that they can gather together around the harbor. And then they tootle off and they drop a little bit here, pick up something, drop off something. And it's the sense that you get from the Caribbean. It's these merchants who are just going island to island, seeing what sells where and picking up whatever is convenient in some respects. And I think that, you and I were talking about really thinking about the Caribbean as the center of the world at this point, because it's where everybody's breaking the rules. And you've got Spanish, French, British, American, Dutch. You've got people who are using the title of privateer, which means that your state is sponsoring your kind of plunder. So the whole idea of plunder becomes really interesting as well. And so I think that that's what got me thinking about silver in a very different way as well. So if you think about the Boston silversmiths you know so well, that they're looking to London for workers and for fashion, and they're looking down to the Caribbean for materials, and then they're bringing those materials in sort of without the British officials really sort of paying attention to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think we forget that from an English point of view, the wealth in the Americas was in the Caribbean. It wasn't it wasn't up here. And the Bostonians they derive their wealth from really being the ones who are in charge of the carrying trade. They're carrying this stuff all over the place. And,
yeah,
as you point out, but they choose from what they're carrying, what they think will sell at home or what fits the market. I should get, I don't want to go on too long, but I did, when you were talking about the gravestones, I also thought about the silver too, because one thing you don't talk about that much that I've done a lot on is the communion silver. And one thing I think that's really important is, as you talk about heraldry becoming key to the design of some of these, gravestones, that heraldry also becomes key to some of the engraving on silver, and that this wasn't entirely private, because within a communion, these things were constantly being viewed by other people. And I was struck by the difference between Anglican church silver, which makes a point of the hierarchy, the political hierarchy. This was given by the Queen to your church. This was given by the King to your church. If you look at the American silver in American churches, what I found so distinctive is that they will say, given by, you know, Barbara Ward in memory of, or, you know, this was her gift to the church, or by Ned, you know, by Edward Cooke, his gift to the church. And then possibly, like in the case of Sewell, a cup with a tankard with his coat of arms on it, which we, you know, those of us who know Sewell's diary and all that know the irony of that, because he was given a tankard when he felt he deserved a cup. So there's a hierarchy in those objects too. But in fact, you know, the message being on Anglican church silver or some British silver being literally this, do this in remembrance of me, or do this, you know, or IHS, or definitely Christian allusions. In this case, here's this message from the minister, do this in remembrance of me, and you're drinking out of a cup that asks you to remember your forebears in your town. And so there's a real point where people are seeing the silver, they're seeing the messages on the silver, they're seeing that hierarchy displayed in the silver as you get more and more heraldry. So although it is a private expression that you would see in dining in someone's home, it's also a public expression that you'd see in church when you took communion. So I was just struck.
No, I mean, the whole idea that gravestones, you know, reading gravestones is very much based on your work on reading communion silver. You know, I was thinking more about the domestic space or non-religious kinds of endeavors, but certainly, yeah, I mean, you were very much on my mind thinking about the Hutchinson coat of arms on that great large plate.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that says it all.
Well, you know, we could go into the theology of all that too, where the baptismal basins and all of that. I mean, it really, there's a lot there. So Jerry, you probably have a comment, question.
Well, I do have a comment. I think it's worth noting as we get going here, what a magnificent book this really is. It's beautifully illustrated. It sums up years of work. It's intelligently written. It avoids lots of scholarly jargon, which is a wonderful thing. You can actually read it as a human being, which I think is good. And it, as Ned points out, it covers a period that's been sorely neglected, I think, at least in the decorative arts. And it's a very hard period to teach. And I think avoiding the style names is good because it just gets so confusing between early Baroque, late Baroque, William and Mary, and all that sort of stuff that's hard for people to comprehend. So a pat on the back as we get going here. And it would make a great exhibition. It really picks up where New England Begins stops. And New England Begins, as many remember, was a great show in 1982, really an unsurpassed look at the 17th century, but it stops pretty much at, you know, December 1699, if not sooner. And this really picks up and carries it into the 18th century, I think, in a magnificent way. I did have a question about the 6 materials. I think I know why you picked those. 6, any of you who've read Ned's work know that he doesn't get very far off the shop floor, in his writing, which is a great thing. He has a great understanding of the craft system, the craft techniques and all that. And that comes through in the book very strongly with each of the 6 materials. But some folks have asked maybe why you didn't do more with paper as a material, prints and books. I always think of Mr. Montgomery and pewter and base metals. There's glass, things like that. And I can understand why you didn't do those, but it'd be interesting to know why you picked the 6 you did.
Well, I think that out of all the different materials, I felt like, you know, what's going on with David Hull and American Antiquarian Society with the history of the book, there were a lot of people sort of dealing with book and the book trade and what was being sold in town. You know, I sort of brush briefly into prints themselves in terms of the view, the Burgess view, in terms of talking about the ways in which an artist comes into town, does the drawing, sends it to a engraver in Britain, and then it comes back as a print to be sold on King Street, you know, right near the State House. And so, you know, the way in which a work on paper can move in different places certainly sort of reinforced some of my notion about the commercial and artisanal center of town in the 17 teens and 20s. But it didn't feel like I wanted to go, you know, I want to stay pretty much three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional, I guess. I felt like there were, you know, Sinclair Hitching's work on printmaking. He left a great legacy. And I just felt like that wasn't going to be quite as fresh as the rest of this. Glass was ceramics were hard enough to deal with because, you know, it's incredible vagueness in the written record. And so you're really relying on archaeological materials more than anything else. And glass, to me, was just one of these things that I could not get a handle on. So I dropped that out. And then base metals, you know, they survive, they can survive, but they oftentimes are melted down. And it was really hard for me to speak with certainty, you know, just thinking about what in New England Begins they tried to do even with iron from Saugus was fraught in terms of what's imported, what's locally made. And I found that, you know, pewter between people like Dolbear, Edgell, you know, they're there in the written record, but there's hardly anything that survives that you can really start to piece a story together the same way I could with these other materials. So I was looking for a sufficient object pool to really be able to say something rather than base an argument on three pieces.
Well, that makes sense to me. I know there's some good questions in the chat. I just had one more thought. Well, two thoughts, if I could. One is, I can't never get very far from the great state of New Hampshire, but you do not, I think most of our people on tonight know about the McPhaedrus Warner House in Portsmouth, which I think is probably the greatest house extant of this period.
Yeah,
like the Franklin House, like the Boston, you know, a really great house. And it has its original murals, as you know, that feature Native Americans. And I wondered what, if any, impact you found that Native American culture might have had on material life in your period. If I know, may not be much.
It's really hard to know. You know, I showed that one piece of Colonial ware, and that could be a piece of Native American pottery. And certainly, you know, one of the things that I have been interested in is out in Natick, the John Elliott desk, which has the weirdest kind of carved feet. It's a little bit later, but I've always thought that that's got to be likely a piece of indigenous woodwork for catering to a kind of British aesthetic with brasses put on it, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen.
Have you actually seen that in the flesh? I remember that. I'd forgotten about that.
I haven't seen it in the flesh. It's one of these things that I've always wanted to go and spend some time with.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, we should.
And the other thought I had in your wood chapter, I was thinking what a shame it is that there isn't any much in the way of surviving material for the shipbuilding industry. I think you think of wood in the 18th century, it's really ships and ship carving, and it's all gone, right? As far as you know, I mean, there's not much left.
As far as I know, yeah. I mean, you know, to me, it's actually, this becomes a really interesting point vis-a-vis the Caribbean. And you know, when the
Yes.
Spanish were in what's that?
I said,
The,
yes, yes.
But when the Spanish were in Jamaica, they valued mahogany for shipbuilding. And mahogany is a lot better in terms of water rot, et cetera, than oak. And it's ironic that in some ways, sort of the Anglo world thinks about mahogany only in furniture, you know, starting in the 1720s. And they continue to rely on oak and pine, some of these woods that perhaps haven't survived as well in terms of moist environments. But yeah, I mean, you're right, Jerry. I mean, the shipbuilding and the ancillary trades were the ways in which a lot of these people had their primary source of income. And it's one of these throwaway lines I had in there, but just to remind people that, you know, we oftentimes tend to think it's the merchants who are the tastemakers, who are going to be the ones who have their finger on all the latest and the greatest. But it's actually the people on the ship who get to see all this stuff. They may be the ones who know what's really hot in Jamaica or in Porto or in London and Bristol, because they're the ones who actually are going around and making these kinds of comparisons. And you know, I keep trying to imagine what it would be like to be not just a supercargo, but somebody else on some of these ships who's able to negotiate and parlay their on-location expertise to bring stuff back.
But that's where I think when you talk about the West Indies, that's so important. And the other thing I was thinking about is that, you know, well, because, you know, I've worked on the Diary of Benjamin Walker, which is later than this, but it's in Boston and was kind of ignored, I think, for a long time. It's at the Massachusetts Historical Society because it appears to be mostly about the weather. But in fact, my favorite parts of that diary is when he'll say he's in his shop in Cornhill, looking out on everything. He can tell, he writes down all the ships that have come in today, how many weeks they are out of wherever they've just been to. And he's always saying, so-and-so came into my shop and told me. And these are usually guys who are other artisans. They're sometimes servants, but you just think of this whole network of conversation and passing of news, and particularly when print wasn't as important in the early period, as far as, you know, having a newspaper that would tell you what was going on. It was all very much an oral culture. So when you try to imagine these, oh, you know, somebody's coming in to tell me that this came off someone's ship or whatever, you realize that there's a lot of that going on. And you really, I think in your book, you give us a sense of what that was like. You know, that these things are coming in, they're being discussed. There's a lot of activity that we can get a sense of. But I just love that notion of that oral tradition. And it also made me think a little bit about Jerry Poshes's work on Newfoundland and that idea of the, you know, the sort of concept of furniture as gossip. And the idea that with some of these things, as one person, as one craftsman is coming up with a solution, this becomes their way of taking the facts as they know them, recombining them in the way that we create gossip, you know, bringing the facts together, you know, putting together some other things that aren't there, and coming up with a product that some of these are, it's a little bit of that, you know, that dynamic that's going on in Boston is everybody's trying to come up with their own solution. And that makes for a really dynamic environment in that early period.
Yep.
And Bob, I just had one last thought.
Okay,
won't stop making so much noise here, but I saw a question about how much these things cost in their own time, which Ned can answer.
Yes.
But once upon a time, I did a study, and I don't remember the numbers precisely, but using the value of the Coney Monteith, which was Ned showed a while ago at Yale, calculating its weight in ounces and then have equal amount for the workmanship, you get up with a certain sum, which in the time the Monteith was made around 1700, 1705 or whenever, the value of the Monteith itself was worth more than something like 30% of the worldly goods of everybody in Boston individually. So, you know, these things that in Ned's book, many of them are indeed were expensive in their own time. It's hard to translate that into $21 and cents, but they were expensive.
But
So
then
I
how
see
about
lots
things
of
other
like,
questions.
thing
I'll shut up here.
yeah,
Oh,
the
I
chairs, the
noticed
other
a
things?
question too about so little overlap in decorative motifs. But I
Mhm.
think, in fact, Ned, you could speak to there really is quite a bit of overlap in decorative motifs
What, between materials,
from
you're
one
saying?
medium to another.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
certainly you can find heraldic devices translated across the board, ceramic, gravestone, silver, obviously. There are ways in which you might think about some of the so-called book ornaments on gravestones, as well as painted ceramics. So yeah, I mean, there are ways in which, but I think that a lot of that has to do, it's not just a Boston specific. This is the world of image generation. Is you get ideas about motifs from other objects as well as print sources. And so they tend to all kind of overlap.
Yeah, or textile motifs that show up in embroidery motifs that also show up in engraving on silver. Because I think
Yeah,
in the
actually,
book you did do a lot with that.
yeah, I mean, the textiles have become a really interesting, the Fiffield bed hangings that I showed. You know, there's a really interesting dialogue between Coromandel Coast painted cottons and British embroidery, that the British embroiderers were some of the first people who started to use different colored threads to get gradations on leaves and flowers. And then the Indian dyers started using mordants and resist dyeings, et cetera, to get shades as well, in imitation of the embroidery work. And then the embroiderers picked up some of the motifs from the Coromandel Coast, which then get translated into the kits that the Fiffield family did. So, I mean, that to me just
That's
becomes
really
this
cool.
really fascinating story about who's ultimately influencing other. I mean, everybody is, it's, the exchange is passing literally on the water as these ships are going back and forth.
Thank you. We do have a number of really interesting questions from folks. One is about furniture caning. Is this dependent on the Dutch East Indies? And when does this style actually come to Boston?
The classic person who's done work on that, Ben O'Forman, talks about cane chairs appearing in the late 1670s, early 1680s. They're probably imported at that point, but soon thereafter, they start having local production, substituting maple for birch, for beech, sorry, but still relying on the Southeast Asian supply of the rattan, of the cane, to do the seating in the backs.
And let's see, Joe Bagley, who is, as you probably know, the city archaeologist for Boston, has a
Who's
number
done
of
fabulous work, who's,
yes.
you know, all the ceramic stuff is so dependent on the work that he and his predecessors, like Steve Pendry, have done.
So one of his questions is really about, you know, you were talking about more high-end things, and he wondered about if these are translated into more mundane, less expensive goods, and is there some less fancy version of what you're showing, or do these middle-class objects differ in other ways, and are middle-class objects, you know, is there a difference, or do you know
Yeah, I
if
mean,
there's a difference?
typically, you know, instead of having, you know, a japanned piece of furniture is not going to be owned by a middle-class person. They're probably going to go either with something that is probably going to be more like a joined oak chest of drawers, rather than something that, you know, so it's sort of part joinery and part cabinet maker, to use those kinds of distinctions. If we thought about ceramics, I think, you know, local earthenware is being used in a very different way than imported ceramics. So I think there the difference is oftentimes quantity more than sort of differentiation in terms of, I mean, obviously porcelain is only going to be, you know, very few pieces of porcelain survive from this period. Those are going to be people with connections, and it's not going to be, it's going to be, you know, one cup that broke or something like that. Silver obviously is going to be at the high end for the points that Jerry just made about the Coney Monteith.
Yeah. And, you know, the discussion of, you know, the Caribbean really being the center, and much of your work really is on who made these things. So the question comes up if you found much on enslaved workers or the people who are doing the work free or slave, and how that relates to the story.
It's something that, again, you know, the one privy that's dug up in the North End as part of the Big Dig, that woman, Nanny, she had a slave.
Katherine Nanny Naylor. Yeah.
Yeah, but, you know, do we know? I mean, it's one of these frustrating things. If you want to think about Du Bois's notion of double consciousness of these slaves who are employed to do certain things, do they assume a different identity in production than they do in other ways? I just felt like I couldn't go there other than the fact that we know that they're in town, but I don't have any kind of evidence, either documentary or through material convention, you know, technical conventions that would indicate there are people who are the enslaved kinds of artisans.
Yeah. And since Joe Bagley has spent a good deal of time digging up these things, he wants to know about the Chinese import porcelain in the early 18th century. And was there a big demand for this, or was it just something that was available?
I think it's something people sort of stumble across more than anything else. I don't, you know, the trade for porcelain, it's hard to see. And this is where some of the written records are so frustrating, because, you know, inventories will just sort of say a lot of ceramics, or, you know, they'll just say plates, or, you know, they're so vague in terms of what they tell you, that kind of gradation between, you know, when you get to the 1760s and people will say burnt china versus creamware versus, you know, something at tin glaze or whatever, you'll get a real stoneware. You'll get a real sense of these different kinds of ceramic presences. But here, it was really hard to see, you know, even people who are sort of international types, you know, like one would think that maybe somebody like Joseph Dudley would have porcelain somewhere, but yeah. I haven't seen anything.
And let's see, Steve Bortnick, who wanted to know how much things cost, also wants to know if people on the Shawmut Peninsula were mainly making their own furniture, or were they importing their own furniture? Do you have any sense of that?
They were doing both. Time-honored tradition. It's one of the things that I found really interesting is, you know, we automatically assume furniture doesn't ship well, and you always make your own. But yet, when I went through the account books of Thomas Grant, who, you know, was a merchant and then, you know, ultimately influenced the work of Samuel Grant as an upholsterer, Fitch was actually dealing with a lot of goods, and he's importing cane chairs, he's importing Japan furniture in 1709. You know, there's stuff coming over here, and you see it within a lot of the sales records in those early newspapers as well, that they have, you know, different kind of venues for selling imported walnut British desk and bookcases and things like that. So yeah, I mean, there are fancy pieces, there are big pieces, there are looking glasses. There's a lot of stuff that's being imported from Britain.
Interesting. And let's see, a couple of other questions about gravestones. And I think you did speak a little bit about this, but was there a different style of carving here than in England?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. You, you could break down sort of the British kind of tradition. You know, you can have high-end, elaborate, figural, you know, almost royal kinds of tombs you could find. If you had a brass on the inside of a church, that meant you were fairly well established. Outside the church, you could have very architectural, either tabletop stones or very architecturally carved, you know, fairly deep relief stones in lighter materials. So slate is important here. The verbiage on it is important, and sort of the ways in which the decoration ends up being shallow relief, if there is anything at all. And that's why I said it's, to me, it's so much more about print culture than it is sculptural architectural culture.
And just to add a word about importations, Ned, you, on page 1 and 2 of your book, you quote that Sewell letter listing all this jazz he's ordered from England, which is amazing in its specificity and the amount of it. So.
Yeah, he knew exactly what he wanted.
Right, it's looking glasses, it's dozens of chairs, or dozen chairs, a whole bunch of big stuff.
It's base metals, yeah.
And furniture did ship easily by water. That great chest on chest at Yale, you know, the Derby family one on the top of the lower case has in chalk, you know, keep this from sun, from wet, and from bruises. It's enough. It's of consequence enough to merit great attention. So they were telling the ship people, don't get this thing wet. You know, it's worth a fortune. When it went from Dorchester up to Salem in whatever it was, 1791, a little later.
And let's see, Jeff Perlman wants to know if any of us have been to the Romney Marsh burial ground in Revere. And I'm guessing it's worth seeing. So, good. Okay.
Duly noted.
That'll be our next field trip. Yes.
Yeah.
So, any further thoughts, Jerry, Barbara, or Ned? Do you have a favorite piece?
Did you find anything in looking at gravestones? Because I'm interested in, you know, so sort of where people sat in church and you know, what we know from the meeting house plans with people's names on it. Did you ever try to map any of the burying grounds for where the primary most important graves were, or stones?
I've had a hard time because a lot of them got shuffled and improved over time. So, you know, in spite of the fact that people always say, oh, it's one of the great sources, you know, it's always been there. Actually, there's this wonderful article that talks about the Boston burying grounds being rearranged, and, you know, people wanting to realign them. And so I tend not to try to
roads would get in the way too. I mean, that happened in Portsmouth. Some of the graves are now under roads, and yeah, that's true.
Or New Haven, where they took them off the green and then they lined them along the wall of Grove Street Cemetery.
Well, if you don't tell anybody, the MFA, we had a few gravestones certain people had saved from destruction and lent to the museum, which we had to send back. But I didn't say that.
We didn't.
Well, at least you didn't use it as a coffee table.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. This has been really a fascinating discussion, and I know everyone will look forward to reading your book. In normal times, we would have the book available for Jeff Perlman is willing to give us a tour of the Romney Marsh burial ground, so let's let him know. So the book, Inventing Boston.
As we can all get out. Right?
Yes. And so thank you, Ned and Barbara and Jerry, for joining us, and thank you all for everyone who participated. So thank you all.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
I would like to say one more thing that sort of seconds what Jerry had said before. It is an absolutely gorgeous book. I mean, unlike academic publishers who sometimes will skimp on the photographs or not make them big enough or do a good job with the color, this book is spectacular.
Yes, it is.
So it is.
They were really good to work with. Yale Press in London really understood what I was trying to do with it.
That was a nice job.
Very good.
It's amazing.
Thank you all.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Barbara and Jerry.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you, Ned.
Beats working. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.